Hello, all, and welcome to One Spooked Professor. I'm Nathan, and I'll be the one droning on and on about all things horror in this podcast. If the name didn't give it away, we're going to be focused on the spooky, analyzing the horror genre and its reoccurring tropes and patterns, as well as monsters, legends, and even horrific elements in non horror works. All of this to come to a deeper understanding of how horror works in storytelling. Why? Well, for one, storytelling is how humans codify and understand the world around them. We also share that understanding with others through storytelling. That horror stories have been around long before the popular genre of horror, dating all the way back to antiquity and beyond, says something about how timeless these themes are. The other, more honest answer is that it's just fun for me. I'm doing this for a good time, and I hope that you have just as much of a good time, or at least a little bit as much of a good time as I am listening to me babble on and on about the scary. So let's jump right into it. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on many of the common forms of horror and how those forms relate to the central four types of conflict in literature and storytelling in general. You can also think of this as an overview of what's to come because we're going to devote whole episodes to many of the subjects that we cover today in greater detail. With that being said, I want to first come to some sort of common ground as to what defines horror. It helps to have the same definition when we're going to be discussing horror so that we understand what we're talking about. This avoids confusion that can sometimes occur in any debate. I've seen equivocation and confusion consume entire debates when you have two different people working with two different understandings of the same term. You can see this a lot in discussions of racism, where one person considers racism systemic, where the other is using a definition similar to that of prejudice, and thus they cannot seem to even get past the fact they're using the same term in different ways, and thus I want to avoid those pitfalls. When we're discussing genre, I often ask my students what they think horror is. Invariably, someone ends up saying something along the lines of something that scares you or something scary. Well, that's true. Works intended to frighten make up a significant amount of the horror genre, but that's not all there is to it. Some horror works are designed to disgust. An example of this would be The Human Centipede. Is it very scary? Well, no, it isn't. But it's pretty disgusting, to the point where some people abandon it partway through. They just can't handle it anymore. Sometimes the horror is designed to startle us, shock us, or make us feel disquieted in some other startling way. There is also atmospheric horror that gives us a sense of unease. You often see this in the Silent Hill video games. The one thing that all of these definitions have in common is that horror is designed to evoke emotional response, often that of fear, but always one of discomfort. Even when we take pleasure in horror, we're doing so through the form of the uncomfortable. I don't want to make horror synonymous with discomfort, but discomfort is related to all of the emotional reactions horror is intended to generate. Now, this is a very broad definition, and some authors and some critics and directors would disagree with me on this. A good example would be Stephen King, who allocates horror into three different categories. One of these categories is terror, which is that build-up before you see the monster, or that sense of unease before the terrifying thing happens. It's that build-up. It's the where you face the fear of the unknown, and you don't know what's coming. Then he goes into horror, the horrific moment of the monster reveal, or the actual horrific experience of the accident, or what have you. Then he had schlock horror, or gore horror, or where they throw all sorts of disgusting things at you to make you go, ew. He considered this the lowest form of horror. It's the easiest to do, and it's one of the least effective long term. It's artless. And that's just one example of how people approach the genre differently and how people codify the genre differently. But the definition I'm going to be working with is that of fear, discomfort, and disgust. These are the emotions most often associated with the horror genre. Fear is the dominant one. Fear is the most potent, memorable, and powerful of all the ones I've mentioned. This is because fear is one of the most primal and central emotions in the human psyche, if not the most primal and central of all. Even when you're dealing with someone who has a neurodegenerative illness like Alzheimer's and they've been reduced to something less than a child mentally, they still feel fear. On the other end of the spectrum, before children are truly conscious of who they are and things like object permanence, they still get fear too. Fear is a primary motivator in life. Now, sometimes fear gets a bad rap. If you've ever watched a movie or read a comic book with a supervillain who controls the power of fear and says, "Ah ha ha, I have the power of fear, you shall bow before me," you're probably not meeting a nice guy. But fear has considerable utility. It is a survival mechanism, first and foremost. Fear keeps us alive. It keeps us from doing stupid shit that would get us killed. It can also serve as a method of instruction. This is the reason why so many horror stories are built around the premise of teaching lessons. Fear can even force us into action to forestall tragedy. We've had a Hitler once. We don't want it again. So when we see it coming the next time, we go, nope, no Hitlers, goose step your way right out of here, mustache boy. That's not to say fear doesn't have its downsides. When fear goes out of control, there are often serious consequences. We can find ourselves too paralyzed to act. Fear can lead to anger, paranoia, hatred, bigotry, and genocide. Fear is no joke when it goes crazy. It's got serious power to it, and that power has shaped humanity. If horror's principal interest is fear, then horror is concerned with perhaps the defining aspect of human existence, or at least one of the defining aspects of it. I told you that horror was some important shit, didn't I? At least, that's what I try and tell myself when I'm watching some terrible direct-to-video creature feature. I would call it a guilty pleasure, but I don't feel guilty at all. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's dive into the 4 types of conflict and how those relate to the most common forms of horror in the genre, many of them being distinct subgenres you would recognize. Now, some academics and critics claim there are more than 4 principal types of conflict in storytelling. I can understand why, but I find many of their other suggested types of conflicts are merely derivatives of the primary 4, thus I'm going to focus on those said 4 conflicts. You'll probably recognize these. We've got man versus nature, man versus man, man versus self, and man versus society. Now by man, I don't just mean dudes with dicks. I'm talking about people in a general sense. Some critics and academics now say person versus nature and so on, but I'm using the catch-all term as it was intended in an all-encompassing sense. Boys' clubs may have used the ambiguity of language to try and exclude women from things, but horror is nowhere near as close-minded. Indeed, Gothic horror was heavily influenced by women who wrote it, and often aimed at women. The horror genre is also one of the most consistent throughout its history, in that it has never lacked for female protagonists or antagonists. Terror cares not for our differences. It comes to us just the same, even if what bothers us takes different forms. Man versus nature is the first form of conflict I want to take a look at, in part because it is the oldest. We've pretty much had to deal with that one since we came out of the womb. Heck, since before we came out of the womb. Childbirth was a rather dangerous process, and it only gets more dire when you have to deal with the real world itself. The majority of human history and almost all technological progress has been defined by man versus nature. Since the earliest days of our ancestors, we've struggled against natural forces to avoid starving to death, to avoid freezing to death, to try and not die of some awful illness, to not fall victim to disaster. We have fought to master nature in many ways. We've invented medicine and vaccines to keep our illnesses at bay. We've domesticated animals and plants to feed us and make our lives easier. We pull resources from the body of the earth, and we even build structures to protect our frail bodies. In the modern day, we can even control the environment. In this room, I am the master of the world. I can make it cold, I can make it hot, and I can keep most of the insects out. But when the power goes out, I'm screwed. People in 11 AD would probably think that I can use wizardry to make my life better. All of this progress, though, and we still eventually lose the fight. Once the systems break down, we are still vulnerable to nature. Vulnerability leads to fear and discomfort. That's where the horror in man versus nature really comes out. Man versus nature horror stories can take many different forms. One of the most prominent in human culture is contagion horror. That makes sense when you think about it, because most of us listening to this podcast are probably going to die of disease or our body failing if something else doesn't get us first. That has been the number one killer in our entire existence. Our discomfort around sick people, the panic that comes out at the threat of a new illness. I remember the panics over bird flu, swine flu, and the whole Ebola scare. You can see people reacting out of that primal fear, and that primal fear is often represented in storytelling. If you have ever watched a contagion-based movie, including the movie Contagion, very aptly named, where someone coughs and then touches a rail, and then that person moves on and the camera zooms in on the rail and someone else touches it and we go, oh no, they got it. That's contagion-based horror. We are aware of the microbes that person's just picked up, they're going to get sick and they're going to spread it to others, and people are going to die. We also demonstrate a discomfort with creatures we associate with disease, like flies, maggots, rats, and the like, and you can see these images often used to terrify or discomfort in many different works. Many zombie movies are actually allegories for disease, or disease is directly linked to how the zombie spreads, without the allegory at all. You have got the zombies as that embodiment of disease, easier to see than bacteria, just as threatening, and they spread by biting you and contaminating you. 28 Days Later is a great example of this. Resident Evil is a great example of this. We are still very much afraid of illness, which makes sense. That's how most of us are going to go, as I said before. Another form of man versus nature horror that is still with us and deeply rooted in our primal psyche is that of consumption horror. We actively fear being prey for something else. Man was not always the top predator of the world. Nowadays, pretty much everything else need fear a guy with a gun, but that wasn't always how things went. You can see this particularly in a lot of older stories where you had beasts chasing people and man lamenting how weak we were compared to the strength of a lion or the strength of a boar or the strength of an elephant. Now just get your shotgun, go out, and you can kill Simba no problem, presuming Simba doesn't get the jump on you and that you're ready to deal with conservation laws and the like. Poaching is bad. You are very likely familiar with consumption horror if you ever watched the movie Jaws, or The Ghost in the Darkness, or Cujo, or something like that. We know to be afraid, instinctively, of the beasts that are out to eat us. Another classic form of horror that relates to the man versus nature conflict is elemental horror, or horror fed by an inhospitable environment or disaster. I'd like to call this environmental horror. This isn't Greenpeace or some PETA-approved deal, though. It's a form of horror built around the pure dread of being utterly helpless before the might of the natural world. And this is one we've struggled against for a long time. We had to invent fire to cook our food to avoid being sick, yes, but we also had to use it to keep ourselves warm. We used it to hold back the darkness. We had to clothe ourselves to avoid freezing to death. We had to figure out ways to deal with heat. Nature doesn't give a fuck about you. It is not something you can negotiate with. When you were standing on a beach looking at the tidal wave coming at you that's about to crush you, you are screwed. An avalanche coming your way. That's environmental horror. The roar of the tornado as a black funnel chases you down in a car knowing you can't escape. All of these things fit with that fear of the elements. We are at the elements' mercy, and in many ways we still are. Why do we have problems exploring the depths of the ocean? Pressure. What are the issues that affect space travel or living out beyond Earth? Well, space is an inhospitable environment that we haven't fully conquered yet. And, as I mentioned before, once the power goes out, we are still at the mercy of a heat wave. We are still at the mercy of rain if it floods our home. We are not in control of our surroundings. And whenever we lose control, that is room for fear. Environmental horror often is a partner of other forms of horror, though. Like, say, in the TV show Slasher, when all the characters get trapped in a lodge because of the blizzard. The slasher killing everyone is really the antagonist of the story, but the blizzard is what keeps everyone trapped there. You often see this in a lot of whodunits, particularly older ones, where the phone lines get taken out by a storm and everyone's trapped inside with someone who might be the killer, or what have you. We need fear the world around us, and it's great for creating isolation because isolation feeds into many of the common forms of horror. Perhaps the most famous and deeply rooted of all forms of horror related to man versus nature is that of the unknown. We do not completely understand the world around us. From the moment we looked out of the cave and went, hey, what's out there in the dark? Or from when you imagined a monster in the closet because it was so dark you couldn't see into it. We are dealing with what could be out there. According to H.P. Lovecraft, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Now, all four types of conflict could and do often involve fear of the unknown, but I mention it under man versus nature because the world that surrounds us is filled with the unknown. This includes death. You could be the staunchest atheist or staunchest fundamentalist of whatever religion have you, and you still have to face fear of the unknown when it comes to death. A lot of horror is all about glancing at that doorway, trying to peek through, but never being able to cross it until you die. We just don't know what happens. We've had people with near-death experiences, we've had scientists talk about the biological process of the brain, but we are never quite 100% sure what approaches with death. Fear of the unknown also allows us to hide our monsters. When you lived in ancient Greece and you never traveled beyond the boundaries of Turkey, could there be monsters at the edges of the map? Could there be dragons there? Yes. Now that we've explored much of the Earth, where do a lot of our monsters come from? Space. We put our monsters in the unknown because that's where they could live. One of the last forms of horror, which is actually a subgenre in and of itself, that often relates to man versus nature, though it can relate to man versus man and any of the others, is body horror. This sometimes overlaps with fears like those of contagion or consumption, but body horror is a really wide category that covers anything horrifying related to deformity, mutation, the distortion or destruction of or breakdown of the human form, including those that come from diseases or parasites, and even uncanny valley-esque things. This can come in so many different forms that we have a plethora of examples. Remember when I mentioned the human centipede earlier? Having your mouth sewn to someone else's ass is definitely body horror. John Carpenter's The Thing is one of the wildest examples, considering how everyone who is the Thing changes when they reveal themselves. I mean, there's a scene where a head grows crab legs and walks away. That's one of the tamer parts of the movie, by the way. Anything made by H.R. Geiger lives and breathes body horror. The Fly is a classic example of this, and if you've seen old Christian renditions of demonic beings, you've come across visual examples of body horror by the dozen. Like contagion-based horror, this one is very much derived from primal fears relating to our health. It's also based on our expectation of how the human form is supposed to be. Horror lives where the sanctity is violated. Those are some of the most common forms that man versus nature takes. One that I include under man versus nature that a lot of critics would disagree with me on is man versus the supernatural. A lot of critics put that as its own category. I, however, consider man versus the supernatural to be a part of man versus nature. Because if the supernatural really does exist and these forces are a part of our world, then they are natural forces. And they also function very much like man versus nature conflicts already do. Add on to that a lot of supernatural beings use natural forces as their weapons, like the gods striking Thebes with the plague to punish Oedipus for what he did to his father and forcing him to investigate, hey, who murdered the king? Or what have you. Supernatural forces use the natural, in part because they're linked to it. And a lot of pre-modernity mythologies used supernatural origins for natural forces. Thus, man versus the supernatural almost always works either like man versus man or like man versus nature. Either we don't understand it and it involves a lot of fear of the unknown, or we do understand it and it does have rules that can be followed. Either it does have a motive and it fits more around a human motive, or it's not something we can understand and is more like trying to bargain with nature, which is to say, absolutely impossible. Then comes the second most common form of conflict in human storytelling. Pretty much as soon as we figured out how not to die of starvation or exposure, one man smacked another man upside the head with a rock. Sometimes we didn't even wait till we finished surviving, because that's how we humans do. One of the oldest staples of interhuman horror is violent horror. This one is so common in the genre to the point that I feel a little silly even having to mention it. It's also the formation of other non-horror genres like action. You all know this one if you've ever seen a horror movie or even had one described to you when you were 5 years old. Though why a 5-year-old is watching horror movies, I don't know. I mean, I did when I was 5, but I slept with a nightlight for most of my life because I saw aliens at that age, so maybe I'm not a good model to follow there. In violent horror, we fear what our man can do to us. We are aware that our neighbor could shoot us. We are aware that other human beings can use violence against us. Now, can violent horror also be related to man versus nature? Of course. Can it also relate to man versus society and even man versus self in the form of self-harm? Of course it could. But it is most usually associated with man versus man. If you've seen a slasher movie, you've dealt with violent horror. If you have ever seen any sort of movie related to one human killing another, you're probably dealing with violence in some way, shape, or form. It's basically in the description of what I said. One person killing another, or maiming them, or hurting them. One could argue there's even non-physical violent horror, psychologically violent horror, socially violent horror, though these are not as common or as famous. Pursuit horror is another form of horror that we are very familiar with from things like slasher movies or the like, where you have something chasing you. Now, like violent horror, this could also fit with Man vs. Nature if the pursuer is a bear or a pack of wolves. Hello, the Edge and the Grey. But you often see this more with human figures like stalkers. Look, the yanderes are coming. Or killers out for revenge. Hello, Jason Voorhees and Yo Mama. Or even Nemesis or the Tyrant from Resident Evil. If you ever played the Resident Evil games, you know what I'm talking about. You have someone chasing you. You have someone pursuing you, and they're not giving up. You always feel the pressure of the pursuit. And if they reach you, bad things will happen. There are a lot of real-life versions of this we are still very familiar with. The psycho ex, the abusive partner. It doesn't all need to be serial killers and murderers. It can be the people we just want to get away from. Perhaps an abusive parent, or just a sibling who won't take the hint. Now, one often related to Man vs. Man that makes people very uncomfortable is sexual horror. And I'm sure when we do an episode on that, a lot of you are probably going to want to skip that one. But it is a central subgenre when it comes to horror, and it's divided up into many more subgenres. You have seen this in a lot of different variations, whether it's the seductress who tries to lure someone away so that they can be killed in the forms of like the siren. Part of the reason a lot of people will avoid any discussion of it is because sex and intimacy make us uncomfortable. It's where we're at our most vulnerable, and lust is a driving force in a lot of people's minds. Not everyone's, but a lot of them. And sex has defined a great deal of our society. So you've got that mix of the forbidden, plus that mix of the universal. Whenever you have sexual horror, you mix that disgust and fear to some degree with titillation or with the biological processes of sex. Now, this can take many different forms. Would you be surprised to know that Alien is actually a form of sexual horror? It's a story of rape. What happens to Kane that unleashes the alien on the spaceship? He gets raped by a facehugger and gives birth. These aliens don't care about our gender. They're reproducing their own way, and because of the alien nature of the reproduction, we don't necessarily associate it with a rape story. Even though if you look at the alien, it's basically the incarnation of violation. It's got a penis-shaped head, it's got a tongue that shoots out at you, it's got a very phallic tail, it's got that androgynous feminine-masculine mixed build. It is rape walking, and it's coming to get you. I'm telling you, if one of those things were on board the spaceship with me, I'd be in the escape pod. Fuck the cat, I'm leaving it behind. Then there's horror where we deal with temptation as the threat. You can see this with Greek myths of the sirens or many temptation figures that lured men or women into places where they were vulnerable and could be killed. Many horrific creatures will draw us to them with their raw sexuality, including Syl from Species. I mean, Syl was played by Natasha Henstridge, for goodness sake, and while she is going to basically fuck the world into extinction by giving birth to loads of alien monsters, there is still something very appealing about her, and her alien form was also designed by H.R. Geiger, meaning it's inevitably going to be somewhat sexual as well as somewhat horrifying. There's also the erotic horror subgenre, which is all about using that fear or disgust to enhance the titillation, to use the forbidden to make the sexual in some way more gratifying. There are many different forms of sexual horror, often based around violation or the breaking of taboo. And any discussion of horror that leaves it out just because it's uncomfortable is leaving out a part of what makes horror horrific. It's uncomfortable. Fear of the other lives within a lot of our socio-political struggles today, and it did so in the past. Conflicts of racism, sexism, nationalism, they are often deep-rooted in our mistrust of the other. We have our people, they have their people, and there's a line. Perhaps we don't understand how the other people think. Perhaps we think we're competing for resources. Perhaps we think that some group is out to get us. What have you. Fear of the other underlies a lot of the terrible things that we do to each other, and thus it is a perfect source for horror, especially horror that deals with social commentary. The film Get Out is a great example of this, where the main character is basically the other in the environment he is in a way that reminds me of Martin Luther King's line where he says, an exile in his own land. And it is the bizarre fascination with the other that forms the basis for what the villains of that movie are doing. I don't want to go too much into it just in case you haven't seen it. Fear of the other feeds on fear of the unknown insofar as it deals with creatures who look like us. Who knows what this person's been through? Who knows what he's going to do to you? Fear of the other can also work on a systemic level, making us fear a society that produces people different from us, or make us fear a society that we see as dangerous to our own, antithetical to our very existence. Then there's imposter horror. If you've ever heard about the old myths of the changelings, or watched a sci-fi show with an evil shapeshifter, odds are good you are already familiar with imposter horror in its most prominent examples. Sadly, this genre draws its origins from many forms of mental illness or conditions we now medically recognize, such as when a mom holds her child and doesn't believe the child's hers, and this can lead to all sorts of issues. It also plays on our fear of vulnerabilities with others. What if we're intimate with someone and they don't turn out to be who we thought they were? Well, All of these relate to that whole notion of imposter horror, which is built upon deception, which is built upon the fear of not understanding what is in another's mind. And if someone else replaces a loved one, or we're still you and takes your life over, oh boy. So that's imposter horror. After man versus man, you get man versus self. After the earth has tried to kill you and your fellow man has tried to kill you, you probably feel a little worn out. Well, guess what? Sometimes your own mind can work to kill you, or your own body can say, fuck it, I'm done with you. And that's where psychological horror is the quintessential form. This is where your own mind, your own perceptions, or your own understanding of reality works against you. A great example of this is in the anime Perfect Blue, where the main character's perception of reality is twisted by her work in the film industry, by her own occupation as an idol, where other people have their own ideas of her, and she doesn't have that good of an idea of who she is herself. And even now, if I go back and rewatch that movie, there are points of it where even I cannot tell between the hallucination and the actual reality, even though by the end of it, the story does make sense and comes together as a cohesive narrative. Turn of the Screw is a great example of psychological horror. While yes, it does look like a gothic horror story, it is quite possible that all of this stuff is happening in her mind. Then there's issues like addiction, which can often play into psychological horror as well. Misery is definitely a good example of the issues of perception, issues of psychosis, issues of mental illness, all of which can play into psychological horror. Yet psychological horror, for all of its fame, is not the only form of man versus self that horror can take. There is existential horror. Existential horror may owe its existence to the relationship between man and the universe, which kind of seems to fit into the whole man versus nature conflict, but it is a conflict that really takes place in the human mind. Get ready for some serious existential angst in this one, because the answers to the questions, does life have any purpose, or is life anything more than just a simulation or chemical reaction in the brain, or do I really matter, may not be the ones we want. Perhaps more than anything else, this is utterly bone-chilling. We're dealing with the very nature of meaning, and if the meaning isn't what we want it to be, that's terrifying. What's worse, potential existential horrors aren't something that can be fought, and the human mind can break under the stress of this. This is often related to the cosmic horror genre, but the human mind is a tad egocentric, and it doesn't handle the concept of its own utter worthlessness very well. At least, not in these kinds of stories. Black Mirror plays with this a lot too, and if you've ever read anything by Kafka, you've probably come across this. The video game Doki Doki Literature Club is a great example of this in video game form, especially since the villain has their own existential crisis when they realize, I'm in a video game that all centers around the player. My entire world centers around the player. What do I do? You'll even see this as an element in non-horror works like Neon Genesis Evangelion. I notice I'm bringing up a lot of anime examples when it comes to man versus self. It's actually a very common theme in Japanese works in particular. But we Americans are no slouches at it, or anyone else for that matter. Other genres have their fair share of uplifting stories about the meaning of life. Existential horror is the same, except the opposite. The mind is also not the only place where man versus self can end up. Debilitation horror is the most common form of physical horror when it comes to man versus self. Now, I know some people are going to have a problem with the term debilitation horror. It seems insulting, it seems offensive, and if you have an issue with the term, I understand, I'm still going to use it. What is debilitation horror? Well, it's in the name. What is a debilitation? A debilitation is something that seriously affects someone or something's strength or ability to carry on with regular activity. This can be things like blindness, deafness, being unable to walk, being unable to run, and you can see how this might make a character vulnerable to something that is coming after them. Did the guy in the wheelchair survive Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Nope, he couldn't get away. What is Bird Box's horror built around? The fact that you can't use your primary sense. This is particularly terrifying for people who haven't lived very long being blind. They're having to deal with it for the first time. If you've been blind your whole life, perhaps you're more used to it than others and have a better chance at surviving at this. This can also deal with any other forms of physical weakness or the removal of a human sense or something else that locks you down. Debilitation horror can also relate to outside forces that affect the character. Saw, in many ways, will use a very peculiar form of debilitation horror where the characters have all their limbs for the most part, but they're locked down or trapped in something. You could even consider that its own form of subgenre, more related to man versus man than man versus self. As mentioned before, a lot of these genres do not necessarily fit within only one conflict, but can span multiple other ones. Thus, existential horror is not always man versus self, can also involve man versus man or man versus society and the like. And consumption horror can also jump into man versus man. We do fear cannibals, after all. Now, in more uplifting forms of debilitation horror, often a character can turn their debilitation into an advantage. In more uncomfortable forms of debilitation horror, the debilitation leads to the person getting killed or not being able to properly escape the terror. And sometimes the debilitation can be what sets the villain apart from everyone else, like in the movie Don't Breathe. They're dealing with a blind man, but because he's blind, he's had to rely on his other senses and uses them to hunt you. The last type of conflict I want to talk about is man versus society. And like with the others, this one can involve the other types of horror I've already mentioned. Body horror can be involved in man versus society. Violent horror can be involved in man versus society. Pursuit horror, all these things can. But several forms of horror do especially well when it comes to man versus society conflicts. Now, why is man versus society really different from man versus man? After all, a society is just a group of people who do things a certain way. Societies don't really exist beyond the people or goods that make them up, right? In a physical sense, no. But despite that, societies have their own power. Social traditions and social constructs are often self-perpetuating. So a society or a group of people that make up the society or the flow of goods that make up the society bring their own force to bear that vastly outstrips the power differential that can occur in man versus man stories. In a way, a society almost becomes its own natural force. It also deals with the constant conflict of the group versus the individual. A good example of this is expulsion horror. We are social creatures. We are creatures who will feel safer in the group because we are safer in the group. What humans can do together vastly dwarfs whatever one human can do alone. Now, we have a lot of movies that focus on, look what this one individual did for the world. But what a lot of these movies tend to ignore is that many of the greatest inventors, thinkers, or generals, or what have you in the world often had a great deal of help. If you watch Imitation Games, it looks like Turing is doing all of this despite everyone working against him, except for Keira Knightley's character. In real life, it was an advanced team that worked very closely with the government, and that scene where the scientists have to decide whether or not to inform the boat of the Nazis sinking it, that never would have happened. That was a decision for the government and the military, thank you very much. Film tends to overemphasize individual accomplishment, despite the fact that it's often more of a group endeavor. When we are no longer part of the group, we are vulnerable. Indeed, the group may turn against us. This is the heart of expulsion horror. You are expelled from the group, you become the other. You can see this in stories where a person's committed a horrible crime or believed to have committed a horrible crime and become the target of the group, such as in Gone Girl. This can also come when you just emotionally separate from the group and you no longer trust the society you're in, such as you see in young Goodman Brown, where after his vision of the devil and the whole black mass, he can no longer trust the Puritans around him, regardless of whether or not the vision was real. The moment you were expelled from the group, you could become an enemy of the group, you could become a victim of the group, and you no longer have its protection. Another form of conflict we see a lot in Man vs. Society is domination horror. This is where your will is no longer your own. You often see this in a lot of beware the government type examples or stories about the evils of totalitarianism, such as 1984, where the government has the power to dominate you and control aspects of your life. But you can also see this in Man vs. Man a lot too, where one person, perhaps an abusive spouse who controls your finances, or your drug dealer who controls your stash or what have you, has direct control over your life. You are not fully independent. Misery is an interesting example of multiple different forms of conflict all feeding into the singular form of domination horror. Misery herself is a crazy person who has got the writer captured and is at her mercy. But she also controls him with drugs, which allows her to dominate him further. He's being dominated both by misery and his own addiction. Indeed, in an interview, I heard Stephen King talk about the fact that misery is actually a stand-in for his drug addiction. So, fun facts to know and tell there. The previously mentioned Gone Girl also involves a form of domination horror. They play a social game with each other, trying to see who can manipulate public opinion to their side to either ensure control over their own lives or ensure control over the partner's life. By the way, the villainess wins. You can also see Man vs. Society in a more systems analysis form of horror, where the story criticizes the systemic nature of the society, where we talk about evil traditions that the society does or ways the society hurts itself. The lottery is a great example. Black Mirror's social media score episode does a scary what if involving people's lives being determined by their social media score, which in a way parallels what happens to a lot of social media personalities. If they're loved, they do well. If they're not, their lives are destroyed. Their careers are destroyed. This just took it to a logical extreme. Systemic horror is often used to criticize a society and shows you the victimization of the individual by the society as a whole. This has been one of the longest running forms of horror when it comes to Man vs. Society, and still remains a tool for criticism today. Then you have Man vs. Technology, which could fit into a lot of different categories, but I put it particularly into Man vs. Society because of our reliance on technology and what we as a society use technology to do. It can be a part of Man vs. Man conflicts, Man vs. Nature, or Man vs. the Supernatural. It can be part of all of the conflicts I've mentioned. But when you deal with the distance it can create in a society, or how technology can radically change society, you often deal with the most poignant forms of horror it is capable of. The Industrial Revolution did a lot of great things, but it brought unprecedented chaos and change with it. And we remember that. The First and Second World Wars were so terrible because of the technological changes mixing with the societal conflicts of the time. And as AI grows increasingly more advanced, we are looking at another such technological jump that can have huge consequences for our society, and thus we're terrified of it and we're still dealing with it. Thus, Man vs. Technology is very much involved in a lot of Man vs. Society stories. So with all of that said, I think you have some idea of the topics we're going to cover. Now, I'm not just going to do an analysis of the forms of horror in this podcast. I'm going to look at famous monsters and where zombie and vampire myths come from, legends, and all sorts of other things, like the slasher genre, to come up with a better understanding of what spooks us. I hope you'll come along with me in this. This has been One Spooked Professor. Take care, everyone. Have a nice day.